Okay, so this session will feature Jen Weed, class of 1995 and Vice President of Education at CCIM Institute in Chicago, and Nancy Riedl, class of 91. She's the Chief Development Officer at Neighborhood Coalition for Shelter in New York City. Weed and Riedl will discuss challenges and opportunities of being a woman in a leadership role. So I would like to introduce myself. I'm Sage Beardsley. I'm a senior here at the University of Dayton studying international studies, and I'm very excited to be here with you all today. So today's session, we will take advantage of question and answer. So if you have any questions, please feel free to message them in the chat, and we'll be sure to get to those later. And also I'd like to remind you all that this session is being recorded and will be available later. So today we have the opportunity to hear from two highly successful and professionally driven women. Both are current Alumni Association board members. As I previously mentioned, Jen Weed, class of 1995, is the Vice President of Education at CCIM. She majored in history at the University of Dayton and has a master's in education from Kent State, as well as a law degree from Loyola University. Weed is the president-elect on the alumni board. When she takes over as president, she will also sit on the university's board of trustees. In addition to her, we also have Nancy Riedl, class of 91. She's the Chief Development Officer at Neighborhood Coalition for Shelter, majored in public relations, and has held many volunteer roles, including New York Metro Alumni Community Leader. So I'd like to welcome them both right now.
Thank you, Paige. Thank you, Sage.
Thanks, Sage. Good morning, everybody.
So we can get started. If you wouldn't mind, Jen, maybe starting us off with a little bit about your professional background.
Sure. As Sage shared, I worked for CCIM Institute, which we are a membership-based organization that provides education, networking opportunities, technology resources for people in commercial real estate investment. And I oversee our global education strategy. Nancy?
I am the Chief Development Officer at Neighborhood Coalition for Shelter. We're a nonprofit organization that provides housing and supportive services for homeless and formerly homeless New Yorkers.
Both very exciting. So if you wouldn't mind, can you tell us a little bit about what you currently do, just day-to-day basis?
Yep, no problem. I have a team of 11 people. And when I say I'm responsible for our global education strategy, we have members all over the globe, and we offer a designation. So it helps people do their jobs better. It gives them an advanced set of skills to help differentiate them from others in their markets and their industries. So we are constantly thinking about content and trends in commercial real estate, which I know sounds very exciting, especially in a global pandemic when people are not in their offices or hotels at all. But we're thinking about trends, we're thinking about content, we're thinking about how to get resources to our members, and resources all over the globe. Yep, I have a team of 11 and they really do the heavy lifting, and I'm just there to support them and make sure that they can do their jobs as successfully as possible. And I think from a very generic standpoint, every day I get to think big picture strategy and problem solve.
And I am wishing my job was a little bit less exciting right now. Homelessness in New York City is not faring so well during the pandemic. We are a relatively small organization. We serve under 1,000 people every year, and that's including some outreach services and a lot of housing and direct support services. So we really are a direct care organization. We provide supportive housing, and right now we're working on providing housing we have a project to provide housing for students who are experiencing homelessness. So we're working with the City of New York University system and a couple of other partners.
Wow, those both are very, very interesting. So would you mind telling me what's one of your favorite parts of your job?
Oh, a favorite part of my job, I would say, is helping people do their jobs better. If you looked at my LinkedIn profile, my sort of catchphrase in my summary is helping make the world smarter, one association at a time. I work for a trade association, and the education we provide our members allows them to do their jobs better and ultimately serve their clients better. And we hope we're making a difference on a daily basis. And I think that is probably what I enjoy most about my job.
Yeah, I would say for me, there's really two parts. One, kind of the strategic brain part of me loves the project that we're working on. We've been working with, there's a researcher in Philadelphia who did a study on the City University of New York and found that 18% of the community college students experience homelessness within a year. And so our organization really is at the forefront pushing the government, pushing city, state, and federal governments to pay attention to this problem, because it could be such a temporary problem if we infuse, some resources into it. But the part that really gets my heart is just seeing the people that we serve. Last night, we have a volunteer group going to one of our residences tonight to make dinner. And so last night I did the shopping and dropped off the groceries for today. And two of the tenants who we serve, and this is one of our residences where we have 65 men and women who have suffered from mental illness. A lot of them have substance use issues, and they've been chronically homeless. So a lot of them have lived on the streets. They've had really hard lives. And they saw me pull up, and my car is a little red Prius, so they recognize me when I come. And, they immediately, can we help you? Can we carry anything? Let me get the door. They're just, they're so grateful for everything that is done for them. And that really, in terms of having the responsibility of raising money to provide support and to, to pay the staff who is providing the direct care, for me to have that kind of an opportunity, I just absolutely love.
So we're going to start to shift the conversation. As we dive into your professional experience, we will start to discuss questions that will provide some insight to those who are listening today. So both of you are women in leadership roles within your organizations. I was wondering, are there any other female leaders in your organizations?
Yes, I'm really fortunate in my current role that of our senior leadership team, there are 6 of us and 4 of us are women. That is probably the first time in my 25 plus years working that I could say that the women, there are more women than men in the senior leadership roles.
And I similarly, we have an executive team of 4, and half of us are women, including our CEO. And then on our sort of next tier of leadership, there's 5 out of 8 are women. So which is not uncommon in the nonprofit sector.
Yep, and then I think, Nancy, thanks for saying that. When we were preparing for this, we wanted to mention that we both work in the nonprofit world. Nancy's is certainly more altruistic than mine. I work for what is called a 501c6, so we're allowed to lobby in DC and elsewhere. And as all nonprofits should, we operate very much like a for-profit business. And care about some of those things that you don't always see in a nonprofit, like generating a profit, which is a little bit counter to a nonprofit. And you tend to see more women in nonprofits.
So do you think there is an international or internal support system for one another, or have you found that there's more competition working as a team of women?
I would say, from my perspective, I would say it's a sort of an informal support system. I don't know that because we do have so many female leaders, and our organization hasn't always been that way. I was hired by the current CEO. Her predecessor was a man, his predecessor was a woman. So it's always been, there have always been a lot of female leaders in this organization specifically. And I've been in other organizations where it has been more male-led. And I think it's a little bit more intentional. The women do very intentionally look out for each other, or just provide some support, whether it's just being an ear to vent to, that's been absolutely present.
And I would echo some of what Nancy is saying. Although I work for a nonprofit and we have a staff of about 45, and there's great women leadership and we really support each other, our membership base is predominantly older white men. That is the commercial real estate industry in general. So it's an interesting dynamic between staff and then the membership that we serve. And so echoing what Nancy said, I think the women in general are always looking out for one another and supporting each other because we know that we have to. And from on the staff side, our responsibilities are also different than each other. There is no competition. We're not trying to step on each other's toes or one up one another, or steal ideas, because yeah, I'm certainly not ever doing marketing. So whatever's happening over there, they can have all those ideas, and I'm happy to support however I can.
That's great to hear. As a female leader, what has been the most significant barrier in your career, and also what kept you going?
That's a great question. And I would say I don't perceive any barriers that I have encountered to be related to my being female. Doesn't mean it's not the case. And I would also say that I've been pretty fortunate. I started in the fundraising world when I was a student at UD and calling for UD Telefund. And then, was brought to New York by a consultant who worked on the Telefund program in the early days and brought me out here to work on a program in New York. And I think that, my work, there's such a track record. Your success is very easy to put in a spreadsheet and to measure. Whereas I think I have friends and colleagues who are in fields that are a little bit less measurable. And I think that definitely has been a factor.
I started my career in higher education, and I worked in higher ed for 10, 11 years. And then I switched over to association world. And I've worked for 3 different associations that have been a part of very male-dominated industries. So the law, strategic selling within Fortune 500 companies, and now commercial real estate investment. And for me, there was always this sense that I had to prove my competency. I worked for the American Bar Association, and I had a law degree. And so that helped set me apart, and still felt like when I'm talking to these really like big ego, uber powerful men, trial attorneys, judges, that I had to be able to prove what I knew. And that may have been regardless of my gender, but it was certainly something that I felt like I needed to do. And then same with my past 2 employers. It's just, I felt like I had to prove my competency. And what keeps me going is that I love a really good challenge, and also opening the doors for the women that are going to come behind me to make sure that their path is easier moving forward than mine has been.
And Jen, that's a great segue into our next question. How did you reach your level of success given the sector's gender gap, especially among leadership?
Nancy and I talked a little bit about this when we were prepping, and in reflecting on this question and the jobs that I've had for the past 25 years, I've been very strategic in how I approach my roles, and always making sure that next role is setting me up for the next role. And that could be defined in so many different ways, right? It could have been that I made a lateral move, but it got me into the organization that I wanted to be in. It could be that it was a stretch job, and I put myself out there, and someone believed that I had the skills and the competency to go forward in that role. So for me, I'm always thinking about what this job does for me in the future, the responsibilities it will afford me, and then setting me up for success in the next role.
And I would say for me, I came to that understanding in my career a little bit late. I sort of, my career early on, I would say I lucked into working at some organizations that would pay off for me down the road. Early in my career, I worked at the Bronx Zoo and then at the New York Botanical Garden, both of which are very well-known, large New York City institutions that get people's attention. So my resume, I didn't go there for that reason. I loved the jobs that I did. I had great friends at those jobs. They were really, they were fun positions for me. But they did, I know now, set me up for some future successes. And then I would say, I really have worked I've been in the nonprofit world and in the fundraising world since 1991. But I've been in different areas of nonprofit. So I was in the nonprofit, the cultural institutions at the zoo and the garden. And then I shifted into university and healthcare, which are, much more, much larger, more sophisticated, I would say, fundraising type organizations that really led me into the human services sector, which is where my passion is. Sort of making the world better for other people is definitely, it's not a realization I had at the very beginning, but it's something that I think my early positions sort of led me to in a very natural way.
Interesting. So as today's attendees start to look towards their careers and futures, can you guys share some advice on how to handle some of the more challenging conversations? For example, we know there's a gender pay gap, and how do you approach the conversation of asking for a salary increase?
Nancy, I'm going to let you answer,
Okay.
because you do a much better job with this than I do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when Jen and I were talking about it, I have a former coworker who told me that I approach these kind of things like a man. She said, you just go in and you believe you can do the job and you're confident and I think that really is important. And I think that while I'm not sure where that came from. And for sure, it hasn't always been because it has been true. I think I have made a great case for myself being good at something when I didn't know that I was necessarily. But I think that confidence, I think that knowing that you can do it, but also being really mindful. And I would say, I think the best way I can answer this question is from the perspective of the employer. I have somebody on my staff, who really is sort of the second in command in my department. She's younger than I am, and she really sort of does the research. She's very mindful of all of the steps that she's taking, but she's also very firm. And so when we're talking about salary increases or anything along those lines, she's very clear in what her expectations are. She also recognizes that there might be a little bit of a discount, so she aims higher than what she really expects it to be. But she's also pretty direct in terms of, it's never been about, I need more money because my rent is going up or New York City is so expensive. It's always about the value that she brings to the organization. And I think that really is the most important thing. You should always look at your career steps and at your salary as what is the value? And the value isn't always for us, for my department, it's very clear what the value is. But I do have people that work for me who are in areas where it's less clear, who are in communications, who are doing things that aren't as measurable or as directly measurable. And I think, it's still important to be able to find a reason that what you're doing is adding value to the organization. And the organization is looking for that because they wouldn't be investing in you spending your time doing it unless it was important. So just making a case that it's happening well, I think is really the most important piece.
I think that value piece is really important. My last employer, my male counterpart, was making a significant amount of money more than I was, and he was selling the content and the education that I was creating. So one can always make the argument that if you're in sales, you're going to make more money, your comp package is different, bonus, all of those things. But without the people creating the content or the product or whatever for that person to sell, he doesn't have anything. And so when I learned how much my counterpart was making, I went to my CEO who I was reporting into, and I'm like, I don't feel any value here. Like, I understand that, my colleague sells and is bringing in revenue, but he doesn't have anything to do if it's not for me and my team. And if you really value us, there's going to be a little bit more equity between what we make. And so I was able to argue for a pretty significant raise. I think a 20% raise, and then a change in my bonus at the end of the year. And so that value piece is huge. You have to know your worth and what you bring to an organization so that you can always fight for it. And I would add, fight for the people that work with you. I try to do that all the time to pay my team, make sure my team is being paid what they're worth, and we're not underpaying them to save a buck somewhere else.
That piece about working well with your colleagues is really important. So leading into our next question, how should one address the issue if the office culture is negative, specifically towards women?
So my answer is going to be real easy. Leave the job. I worked for someone who the CEO was really has not changed, a misogynist. And it was very clear that he felt women were not as smart or talented as men. And it became more evident all the time. And I had in my mind, I had to stay to change the culture. I had to stay to take care of my team. I had to stay to, advocate for change. And, I stuck it out for about 3 years, and we were in a meeting and he told me in front of the senior staff that my words were dumb because he didn't understand the expression can of worms. So decided the best way to respond to me was to tell me my words were dumb. And in that instant, I gave myself permission to leave the job, right? Like my team, they're a bunch of grown people. If they're not happy, they can leave too. And I have to look out for me before I can look out for anyone else. So if you are in a job where the culture does not support you and the work that you do, I would say leave.
Yeah, I think unless you are in a position, in a high enough position in the organization and the culture is defined, it is, so much of it depends on where the culture comes from. But there's so little, it's hard to change a culture unless you're really getting support from a lot of people and from the leadership. And so if it's the leadership that's defining that culture, I think Jen's advice is probably right on.
Thank you for sharing that. When our male counterparts are seen as ambitious, this is a positive trait. However, when a woman is ambitious, she's often seen as aggressive or demanding. Can you tell me a little bit what your take is on this? Should women try not to be seen as too ambitious, male or female, and what are the traits that you look for in a successful employee?
Nancy, you want to start?
Oh, yes, because it does make me crazy. I think that I hope, although I don't know that I have reason for this hope, that it is just a matter of the world getting used to women in powerful positions. We've seen too many times, and politically over the last several years, women who, when they step up to take higher positions, the criticism of them sounds very different than the criticism of their male counterparts. And it tends to be their voices, their hair, what they're wearing, how they're speaking, that they're stepping out too much. And this happens on both sides of the aisle. This is sort of a universal problem. And that, in the political specter, I think that it might just be a numbers game where you have to get used to hearing women a few times say, I want to be your president, your senator, your congressman, and that needs to become normalized. In the work setting, I think there's a little bit of that, but I think that it's, again, it just goes to the broader culture. I have never let that stop me. If I've been in an organization where that has felt problematic, I've moved on, because it's been clear to me in a few positions that I've reached a point that they're comfortable with, and they're not comfortable with women going beyond a certain point. And I don't need to, that hasn't been a battle that I have felt prepared to fight, because I don't think that it was one, that I was necessarily positioned to win. And so, I have, in cases, I've moved on from positions where that has felt like it was an issue. And I think, finding your support system. And I think the support system for this is surprisingly not always other women. I think other women can be very supportive, but don't discount the fact that men also notice this and care about it.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat what Nancy said, because I would echo so much of that. I will underscore that finding kind of your people to support you in your career goals and your career trajectory. My current CEO is a really great boss. He's awesome. And his network is massive, and someone that I know that I can always go to say, I need you to help me get to here. Like, he knows that, you know, I want to be a CEO by the time I'm 50, and that's my goal. And it's, you know, his job to help me get there. So finding those people to support you, I think, is critical. Sage, the other piece you asked is, you know, what are some of the traits you look for in a successful employee? And when Nancy and I were talking about this, like, these are traits regardless of your gender, right? Like, this is just who you want working with you and on your team. For me, you know, I want colleagues that are authentically themselves. So if you're ambitious, show up that way, right? That work really hard, ask smart questions, offer up solutions, speak up, you know, and never ask someone to do something that you yourself wouldn't do. Those are things that are important to me and on my teams.
So we do have a question that was submitted through the Q&A, and I'll give you some time to think about it, but here it is. Have you seen a difference in workplace culture from when you first started in your careers to currently?
I definitely have. Yeah, I remember early on in my career, and again, this is the early 90s, when there were women, you know, there were often women in very high positions and in senior leadership, but they almost seemed mythical. Like, it didn't feel, it was so noticeable that there was a woman in that position. And I think that now you know, it feels less special, I would say, which I think is a really good thing, that you know, that women in higher roles and in more powerful roles and in different types of institutions. You know, I think that in the human services sector where I am now, seeing women in leadership is very normal, because a lot of social workers tend to rise to the top in this field. And so it's not, you know, that's not that abnormal. But in healthcare, in universities, you know, I think it is a little bit less. They were a little bit later to come to, you know, sort of women in leadership roles. And I think you're seeing that definitely more and more.
And I think it's also put out in the policies that organizations embrace. There is, I think it was driven by women, and now I think everyone benefits from it. But the flexibility that you see more of in your workplace, and I'm going to go pre-COVID because COVID just blew everything up, right? But you know, pre-COVID, thinking through remote work and flexible hours and being a caregiver while you're also working, and are you a caregiver for elderly parents or young people, or, you know, a spouse or partner, and putting some policies into place that benefit everyone, right? You know, I think if you give people the ability to adapt work and life in a very thoughtful way, I think they show up better. They're a little bit more loyal, and they care more about the work that they're doing when their employer values them. And so I definitely do think that women have driven some of that, where because women so often are expected to do so much. You know, they are the perceived caregiver, they are the perceived you know, doing all these things that we never necessarily expect men to do. And you've seen a shift in recognizing that everyone is capable of doing everything when given the resources to do that.
So our next question, are there any things you feel you need to avoid doing that your male counterparts would not feel necessary to avoid?
I would say, I would answer this one, and not even necessarily for myself. And it's not as much avoid doing, but do differently. I think when I've seen, I don't have children. When I have seen women in the workplace with children, I think, you know, ask for things that they deserve and that make sense for them. It is not always well received. And this goes back to sort of what Jen was talking about in terms of, you know, sort of work-life balance, and just the flexibility hasn't always been there. And in some workplaces, some workplaces are more flexible than others. I think that for women, where that is an issue, it's important to approach it. I'm sorry, my voice is going away. It's important to approach it from a from a value perspective, again, you know, that I will be able to get my job done. I had somebody work for me in a previous position who had 3 young children, and her husband worked farther from the office and he had flexibility, but he had to plan his flexibility. And so if a child got sick unexpectedly, she was often the one who had to go. Now, they were extremely balanced in how they took care of these things, but the logistics, she drove to work, he took the train, you know, there were a lot of reasons that it made sense for her. She had the kind of, you know, she was able to say, I have to leave now to take care of this, but I'll be able to get these things done at this time. And so she was always very clear that she was paying attention to the work that had to get done, and she brought the solution to me. And I think that that's something that, you know, I guess the fairness in that, I don't know that it exists, and it's possible that men less often are confronted with this challenge. And so I'm not sure that that is as much a male versus female, but I think that, you know, that's definitely something that I've observed as a manager.
Sage, I'm going to twist the question a little bit. This is something that Nancy and I talked about, and I want to make sure we get a chance to sort of put this out there. I don't know that as women we do as good of a job as we could at applying for those jobs that might be a little bit of a stretch job. There's you know, it floats around the internet that there's a job description for someone that breastfeeds, and a woman looks at the job description and she's like, oh, I think I can do that, maybe, I'm not sure, and the guy looks at it and he's like, absolutely, I can do that, and applies for the job, right? And men cannot breastfeed, they cannot do that, biologically cannot do that, right? But you know, historically men they just go after the next job that they want. And I would say that in my first few jobs I was like that. Can I check off every requirement in this job, right? Do I meet it all? Do I have the education? Do I have the skills? Do I have the preferred skills? Do, you know, all of these things? And if I didn't, I wasn't going to apply for the job. And I think that's a miss, right? Nobody has everything. Like, that's whoever writes job descriptions. Like, I saw something this week where, you know, it also floating around the internet where they want 15 years of social media experience. Okay, well, 15 years ago, what was social media 15 years ago, right? You know, like in 2005, like what was it like? You know, like, come on. And so no one has. Like,
I have 5 years on Facebook, 3 years on Instagram.
Right. I mean, what was even happening 15 years ago? So I think, you know, putting yourself out there and positioning yourself in the best possible way and going for those reach jobs is really important. And so what if you don't get it? Who cares? You know, I mean, you go on to the next one. So I think that is something I've tried to do much more as I've gotten older, is go after jobs that in the past I wouldn't have gone after. So I kind of turned your question around, Sage.
That's okay. We also have another question. So as a woman, do you think it is harder to manage work-life balance? For example, do you feel like you can say no when a leader asks you to do work outside of your normal hours?
So I'm going to put the gender piece aside. For me, I don't know that it has anything to do with gender. And for a long time, I thought it had to do with the fact that I didn't have that there would be an expectation of later nights or weekend events because I didn't have something else that I needed to do. So less about my gender and more about what my family unit looked like. And I don't, as I've grown in my career, again, I think it's less about gender and more about, I love to work. I really like, I don't know, it's just kind of who I am. I really like to work. So work-life balance is really not my thing. And I can own that, but it's also something I acknowledge and I'm comfortable with. And I know where I absolutely have to draw my boundaries. COVID has really forced that, right? When your office is now your guest bedroom, which is next to your kitchen, and you know, you can constantly see that glowing monitor. I could work from, you know, I get up at 5:30. I could work from 5:30 in the morning until I go to bed at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. and maybe take a break for a meal or two. And that's just completely unhealthy. So COVID's forced me to get some work-life balance that I didn't have before. But for me, I really don't think it's a gender thing. Nancy, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, that has also been my experience. And I think, the work-life balance is absolutely, COVID has sort of exposed, I think, a lack of work-life balance for a lot of people. And, for me, similar to Jen, my transition to work used to be I would take a commuter train, then I would take the subway, then I would walk a few blocks. I had a very, very broad line between life and work. And now it's a few steps. And so, that said, I have a CEO who is extremely mindful of that. She's not necessarily good at it for herself, but we're working on her. But she is very clear to us that, our work, the work of our organization didn't stop during COVID. It got harder during COVID because we're providing direct services for people who have very significant needs and who suddenly were told you have to stay inside, and we used to try very hard to get them to interact with each other. Now we were trying to get them to stay away from each other. And so just sort of catching them up to understanding that. And a lot of our staff had to continue commuting to their workplaces to do those jobs. And so we really have been extremely careful about making sure that everybody and trying to lead from a place of you have to continue to have a life, even though right now the life is a little more Netflix and a little bit less seeing your friends. It definitely looks different. I have noticed it, and I've been in other organizations where it was much more clear that it was family, not family. But I've gotten actually pretty good at drawing that line.
And what Nancy says about your boss is really spot on. My boss is great about pushing work-life balance, taking vacation time. He takes more vacation than any CEO I've ever had. Draw your own conclusions on that one. But something he says a lot, because at the end of the day, I help rich people make more money. That is what I do. And he will remind me constantly, we are not saving babies. We're not. So you can end your day at 5 o'clock. Like, the world is not going to collapse. Nancy's job is much more important than the work that she's doing. And so that, I think that I feel how that work-life balance could be harder, especially in COVID, when, yeah, you're just trying to do so much to save so many. She doesn't have that ability to, like, hey, we're not saving lives, because they really are. So I see how that's harder.
Well, thank you so much for your insight. I know that the attendees are definitely getting some valued advice out of your responses and your experiences. So we are running out of time, and I was wondering if you had any last minute advice for our attendees as they go as the next generation of female leaders.
One thing that sort of occurs to me as we're talking about this and talking about the intimidation, being a strong female leader can be intimidating or unusual. I think what's important is sort of to turn that into a conversation. I had a situation when I was working in healthcare, and I was at a very large academic medical center. And I was primarily raising money for the Children's Hospital, and the administrator of the hospital, who I had to work with because he oversaw the programs that I was fundraising for. I learned through my boss, who heard from his boss, that I was intimidating him. And I just sat down with him and I said, what's going on? Like, what is really going on? And we talked it through, and, we had a great conversation and ended up becoming very good friends, co-presenting at national conferences and really doing a lot of work together that I think would have been impossible. Now, I unfortunately didn't pick up on this myself. So I think paying attention to when that intimidation might happen. But when you learn of it or sort of notice it, having a conversation and trying to get to the bottom of it, I think, is really important, because it humanizes everybody, and it just sort of brings everybody to the same level, a playing field.
And I would add to that, know what you want and go after it, right? Don't be afraid of being an ambitious woman and understanding what you want to do and where you want to go next. But also know your values and use them as a guiding force, right? You have to understand what your boundaries are. Like what are you willing to tolerate and what are you not willing to tolerate in any sort of environment ever. And then once you become in any sort of position where your decisions can impact others, really think about what that impact is, right? I mean, we're on this planet once and we have to do good work. We have to be good humans. So really think through the impacts that your decisions have.
Well, thank you both again so much for your time, your insight, your advice. I know I really appreciate it as well as all the attendees here. Just a reminder that both Weed and Riedl have profiles within Flyer Connection, so make sure you connect with them. And also, if you are interested in entering the raffle for the free business suit, attend at least one more webinar today and complete your Flyer Connection profile by October 30th. There's a link to the Flyer Connection in the chat today, and also it's available online. So thank you again so much. Again, we really, really appreciate it. And as always, go Flyers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sage, it's so funny to hear you just call me Weed. I mean, I get part of this script. I mean, it's what my friends call me, but it's a little.
And my friends' kids call me Aunt Riedl.
We're all friends here. We're a Flyer
That's
family.
right. Go Flyers.
Yeah, go Flyers. Sage, thanks for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you,
You're
Sage.
welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.